Hello, you're watching the Trews. This week we've seen attacks in Europe and America on people of various religions, and for some reason, Bill O'Reilly looks the happiest I've seen him for ages.
Thanks for watching us. 3 Muslims murdered.
Don't actually raise your eyebrows in joy, Bill. 3 Muslims murdered!
Was it a hate crime?
Good evening. Europe is on edge again tonight after yet another deadly attack.
Today on the Trews, we're looking at 2 sets of murders. One by Omar El-Hussein, committed in Copenhagen, is a convenient murder because it goes along with the media narrative that Muslims are dangerous and Islam is a violent faith. So this set of murders gets a lot of coverage. And the second set of murders on Chapel Hill in America against 3 Muslims, perpetrated by a man called Craig Stephen Hicks, gets less airtime and is being covered in a completely different way because it conflicts with that narrative. Let's have a look.
Today's attack was a chilling echo of last month's deadly attack on the offices of a satirical newspaper in Paris.
So that's the creation of a narrative. 1 week Paris, next week Copenhagen.
The shooting echoing attacks on Charlie Hebdo carried out last month in France.
It's happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere.
So without knowing any of the details, we don't know even the name.
Without knowing any of the details or facts, and basically bluffing my way through life on sheer prejudice alone.
Tonight, the Prime Minister of Denmark is calling it a terrorist attack.
The Omar El-Hussein story is really familiar. A lone Muslim man with a history of violence has committed 2 deadly shootings and the media portrays it as terrorism. The Craig Stephen Hicks story is less familiar. It's a white atheist who has murdered 3 Muslims. But the fact that the second set of murders in Chapel Hill is less familiar is not because it happens less, but because it's reported less and in a different way.
In matters closer to home, a shocking triple murder in the college town of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, is being called a hate crime by the victim's family. All 3 victims were Muslim, but authorities don't believe that was a reason they were gunned down.
If we acknowledge that the Chapel Hill murders were a hate crime, then we have to examine our cultural climate. A cultural climate in which films like American Sniper, which at least simplify the situation in the Middle East and America's position over there, that these kind of films and that kind of narrative are contributing to waves of anti-Muslim feeling. We have to accept that we have a responsibility in the way that we tell stories.
Police say this may have simply been a fight over parking spaces.
So in this instance, the mundanity, the ordinariness is highlighted. This is about parking spaces, but the reality is that Omar El-Hussein has a history of violence. So he's like a violent guy first and a Muslim guy second, whereas Craig Stephen Hicks has never committed any crimes before and has suddenly murdered 3 Muslims. For me, this seems like a response either to a personal ideology or an all-prevailing cultural climate that Muslims are people that can be acted upon with aggression.
All 3 were shot in the head, execution style. The victims were Muslims who'd grown up in America.
But even that's a weird bit of language. They're Americans. They're Americans. These people were Christians that had grown up in America. Americans, you'd call them. So Muslims somehow got in here and then they grew up in America to be Muslims. Say Americans, then it won't seem like you've got a bias against Muslims. No!
Chapel Hill police and other authorities say they believe the shootings were the result of a parking dispute.
Well, that's convenient because there's not a global ideology about parking spaces, is there? We can't all get behind that. We can't all send hashtags about parking spaces. But if it was the murder of Muslims because there's a climate where Muslims are constantly vilified or looked at suspiciously, where there are cartoons of them looking animalistic, then it might seem like it had a bit more weight behind it. But fortunately, this is just a parking dispute.
On Tuesday in Chapel Hill, 3 Muslim students were murdered, shot dead. Police have arrested 46-year-old Craig Stephen Hicks. The FBI now looking into possible hate crime violations, but that investigation has just begun. Hicks is a malcontent, a troublemaker by all accounts.
So here they're trying to narrativize it as being a crazy, lone individual that's nothing to do with his culture. But in the case of Omar El-Hussein, he is seen very much as the representative, a spokesperson for all Islam. But Hicks is not a spokesperson for a dominant narrative in which Muslims are vilified, because that's not a helpful story for Fox News. So, of course, in both cases, terrible murders, but one of these murders has a sort of net worth, a business value, a kind of narrative fuel that Bill O'Reilly and even less obviously prejudiced media outlets can use.
Talking points grieves for the 3 murdered young people. They are innocents, destroyed by a disturbed individual.
How can this be happening? How can this be happening that in the case where Muslims are the victims, oh, this is a disturbed individual, we don't need to think about this. There's been a murder in Copenhagen by a Muslim. Again! Islam!
It is simply revolting that any person would throw around accusations against people who had nothing to do with the murder.
Well, the show's going to be tough today then, Bill, because that's your entire inventory and running order.
The FBI will find out if these murders can be classified as hate crimes, just as the agency did in Ferguson, Missouri.
Now, that's not really a good example, Bill, because what that did was it discovered that a policeman who had murdered a little boy had done nothing wrong. Oh, yeah. Is there any better examples? No, there isn't, because the point you're trying to make can't be made because there is a prevailing condemnatory climate against minorities, whether it's African Americans or Muslims. They will always be vilified to justify the perpetuation of the mainstream narrative, which is the domination of corporate media and the business interests of United States corporations overseas, and anything that conflicts with that will be ultimately vilified. Okay, so it's going to make the show tough for me. Just lie like you do most weeks. Thank you.
But for the haters among us in America, facts don't really matter, do they?
Here are some facts that Bill seems to love. When you hear them, it's going to blow your mind a bit because the way you're told stories doesn't incorporate this information. Did you know that only 2% of all terrorist attacks were committed by Islamic groups or individuals? Like, I can't get my head around that because I can't think what the other 98% are because I never hear those stories about Buddhist or Christian attacks. You can't report that 1 in 5 abortion clinics are attacked by Christian terrorists, or Anders Breivik's murder of 77 people in Norway who was explicitly anti-Muslim. Even when something like that happens, there's a kind of an inflection placed upon it that takes away the inconvenient details. You don't think of Anders Breivik as being virulently anti-Muslim, but that's what he was. The Chapel Hill murders are being presented as this, oh, there's this lone mad individual who's really aggressive about his parking space. We've all been there. But Muslim murders are seen as motivated by a book and a religion, so we can go over there and do what we want. It's okay to condemn them. Well, let me tell you, that's precisely what was happening in Nazi Germany. A group of people were continually maligned. A climate was created culturally where it was okay to dislike them. So eventually, it's okay to fulfill the stated objectives of the powerful.
Nowhere is really safe. I mean, we're safe, but anywhere, the attack can happen anywhere at any time, so you have to be aware.
Be frightened. And if people say that we need more control over you and greater policing and to observe your online activity, just embrace those people straight away and don't ask questions.
Somebody on Twitter a minute ago accused me of fear-mongering, and if that's the case, I'm okay with that, because what I want people to be is aware.
Oh, I'm feeling so aware. I had an aware-mare last night in bed.
Look, if you go in a coffee shop tomorrow after the conversation that we had earlier and you actually look around and something happens and you run and you get out of there, I did my job.
What if you run and nothing happens? What if you spend your whole life running? What if you're so frightened that the activities of your government and media go without ever being questioned because you're so bloody frightened that you can't think straight anymore? Or when actual Muslims are murdered, you don't think about that. You see that as being about a parking space. But when white people are murdered, that's about a 1,000-year-old faith. What we have to do to solve this problem is the opposite of what the media are doing. We have to start questioning this climate of suspicion and hatred and condemnation. If you're English or British or live in this country, well, I'm in England, have a look at stophateuk.org, have a look at We Will Inspire, have a look at Unite Against Fascism. If you're in America, have a look at Take on Hate. But wherever you are, start to question the way that we're given information. Start to question the veracity of the data we're given by institutions like Fox. In a climate where the Chapel Hill murders and the Copenhagen murders are given totally different predominance based on the agenda and objectives of the media and the powerful interests that they support. This information is not objective. It's information that's given to you to skew your worldview and make it easier for them to pursue their agenda around the world. That is some true news. Subscribe here.
Nose is a tool that is abused to fool you and to leave you scared and confused. Trews is like the nose. If the nose was true, I want some Trews. Trews. Let's have some Trews.